He grew up in a town of 475 people, where the biggest life decision you could make was what kind of boat to buy, and then the internet found him. Jacob Knowles is a fifth-generation lobster fisherman from Winter Harbor, Maine, a man whose family has worked the same stretch of cold Atlantic water for over a century. And somehow, while hauling traps before sunrise in orange rubber waders on a 46-foot boat, he became one of the most watched creators in the entire outdoor and working-class space, racking up 1.6 billion views on YouTube alone. By the time you finish watching this, you'll understand exactly how a man whose graduating class had roughly 20 students ended up with a talent agent, a fleet of vacation rental cottages, a private pilot's license, and a following bigger than most cable television networks. Winter Harbor, Maine sits at the edge of the country in more ways than one. Population, around 475. It is a working fishing village, not a tourist town dressed up as one. The kind of place where you know every family, where the economy runs on what comes out of the water, and where the idea of leaving to do something else carries a weight that's hard to explain to anyone who didn't grow up there. Jacob Knowles was born into this world on August 31st, 1993. He didn't choose lobstering. He was folded into it before he could fully process what was happening. His father was a lobsterman, his grandfather before that, and his grandfather's grandfather before that. 5 generations of the same family, working the same waters off the coast of down East Maine. By the time Jacob was 4 or 5 years old, he was already out on the boat with his father, learning by watching, absorbing the rhythms of the work before he was old enough to do much of it himself. At 13, he had his own skiff and 150 traps. Not a toy setup, an actual small-scale commercial operation. By 15, he had upgraded to a bigger boat and was running his own crew. As a high school senior, he upgraded again. He was hauling traps before school, after school, on weekends, and through every summer. His graduating class at Sumner Memorial High School in Sullivan, Maine, had roughly 20 students. His world was small, specific, and built around the ocean. But here's what most coverage of Jacob misses entirely. He also turned to YouTube as a teenager, not to post fishing content, but just to watch it. He's talked openly about using the platform to see how other kids his age lived, kids from somewhere else. In a school that small, in a town that remote, YouTube was a window to a world he couldn't access any other way. He even started making his own videos back then. Hunting, fly fishing, skiing, hiking. He posted consistently for years, and nothing happened. No views to speak of, no momentum. Just a quiet channel that a handful of people watched. He had no idea that the thing that would eventually change everything was the same thing he'd been doing his entire life. The thing so familiar, he'd never thought to film it. And that's when the decision was made. The one nobody around him saw coming. The pivot didn't come from a strategy session. It didn't come from a consultant, or a YouTube course, or a moment of calculated branding. It came from a lobster with eggs. In 2020, Jacob posted a short TikTok video explaining a practice called notching. When a Maine lobsterman pulls up a trap and finds a female lobster carrying eggs, called an egger, the law requires that she be released back into the water. But the practice goes further than that. Fishermen actually carve a small notch into the tail of egg-bearing females before releasing them. That notch acts as a permanent marker. Even if she's caught again in the future, that mark signals to any other fisherman that this is a breeding female, and she goes back in the water every single time, no questions asked. It's a conservation practice built into the culture of Maine lobstering, passed down through generations. Jacob had done it thousands of times. It was completely unremarkable to him. He filmed it in roughly 26 seconds, explained it matter-of-factly, and posted it. That video accumulated roughly 6.2 million views. The comment sections told the whole story. People genuinely did not know where their lobster came from. They didn't know that the industry had built-in conservation rules stretching back generations. They didn't know what an egger was, what a V-notch meant, or that there were strict size limits on what could be kept. For most of Jacob's audience, the entire ecosystem of Maine lobstering, one of the most tightly regulated and historically rich fisheries in the world, was completely invisible. Jacob saw the response and kept going. Shortly after, a video of him rescuing a bird that had blown offshore and landed on his boat drew another 6.5 million views. The bird had exhausted itself fighting the wind, landed on the vessel out of desperation, and Jacob brought it into the wheelhouse, warmed it up, fed it, and returned it to land. The comment section filled with people who had never thought about what happens to birds caught offshore in a Maine nor'easter. He wasn't performing. That's what people latched onto. He was just doing what he did, explaining it as he went, in the same flat, direct tone he'd used to talk to someone standing next to him on the dock. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. The easy version of Jacob Knowles' rise goes like this. Fisherman posts video. Video goes viral. Fisherman gets famous. That version leaves out almost everything important. The content worked for a specific reason that has nothing to do with luck. Jacob was filming a world that television and mainstream media had largely ignored, not because it wasn't interesting, but because nobody had figured out how to make it accessible. Maine lobstering is technical, physical, unglamorous, and deeply specific. It has its own language, highliners, eggers, V-notches, trap limits, zone licensing, sternmen. To an outsider, it's impenetrable. To Jacob, it was Tuesday. The gap between what he knew and what his audience knew was enormous, and that gap, it turns out, is one of the most valuable things a creator can have. Every video was educational without trying to be. He explained things the way you'd explain them to someone sitting in the passenger seat, not dumbed down, not performed, just direct. Viewers came for the novelty and stayed because they actually learned something. He also had a natural comfort in front of the camera that came from one place. He wasn't trying to be a creator. He was a lobsterman who happened to be filming himself. The distinction sounds small. It changes everything about how someone reads you on screen. Behind the scenes, the operation grew quickly. He brought on a videographer. He signed with a talent management agency, _talent, which handles partnerships and brand deals. Sponsorships started coming in, Factor Meals, First Form, and others. The kind of deals that require an established audience and the credibility to carry them without alienating that audience. Jacob's audience, working class and outdoors oriented, trusted him because he never felt like he was selling anything he didn't already use. And all of this was happening while he was still waking up before sunrise, still hauling traps, still working the same stretch of ocean he'd worked since he was a teenager. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. The question his viewers ask most often sounds simple. Why don't more people do what you do? The answer is one of the most underreported stories in the entire outdoor creator space. Getting a commercial lobster license in Maine is not just difficult. For most people, it is effectively impossible. Maine operates a limited entry system for lobster licenses, put in place in 1997 to protect both the fishery and the communities that depend on it. The idea is straightforward. Control the number of boats working the water, and you protect the long-term sustainability of the catch. In practice, what that means is a waiting list that stretches for years, sometimes decades. To even get on the waiting list, you have to complete an apprenticeship program that requires logging at least 1,000 hours on someone else's boat. Once you've done that, you sit. In Jacob's zone, the entry-exit ratio is roughly 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, meaning 2 or 3 license holders have to permanently leave the fishery before one new person can come off the waiting list. Jacob himself has said he knows people who have been trying to get licenses for 10 years, with no end in sight. There's a provision that benefits families like his. Children who come up through fishing families can start accumulating apprentice hours at a very young age and apply for a license before they turn 23, bypassing the worst of the waiting list. Jacob had already been fishing commercially for years by the time he formally licensed. That head start, rooted in 5 generations of family knowledge, is part of what makes his position genuinely difficult to replicate. He testified before the Maine legislature about an entirely separate crisis bearing down on the industry, the collapse of herring quotas. Herring is the primary bait used in lobster traps. When federal regulators slashed herring quotas after the species failed to reproduce in sustainable numbers, Maine lobstermen faced a bait shortage that Jacob described in his testimony as severe enough to consume 4 to 5 hours of additional work per day just to secure enough bait to go fishing. The cost of the available bait had also risen sharply. On top of all of that sits the ongoing federal battle over North Atlantic right whale protections. NOAA has been pushing for lobster gear modifications, including restrictions on the vertical rope lines connecting traps to buoys, that Maine lobstermen argue would be economically devastating. The fight has been grinding through the courts and through Congress for years, with Maine's congressional delegation pushing hard to delay and modify the requirements. Jacob has spoken about all of this publicly. He understands that the life he's built and the tradition he's documenting could face pressures that no amount of viral content can fix. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. Most people who follow Jacob know the name of his boat before they know anything else about him. The FV Rest Ashore. It's a pun layered inside a wordplay, layered inside a tribute. FV stands for fishing vessel. Ashore combines oar, nautical terminology, with Ashley, the name of Jacob's wife. Rest ashore, rest ashore. The boat itself is named for the woman he's been with since high school. Jacob and Ashley Knowles grew up together in that same small corner of Maine. They've built everything side by side: the fishing operation, the family, and now an entirely separate business venture that most of his audience doesn't fully understand the scale of. Rest Ashore Cottages is a vacation rental operation that Jacob and Ashley developed after they recognized something he's talked about on his platforms. The future of any single industry, including lobstering, is never guaranteed. Regulations change, quotas shift, markets move. They bought a rundown coastal property, the former Albee Cottage property, and rebuilt it into a multi-unit rental operation with oceanfront access, situated a few miles from Schoodic Point and Acadia National Park. The genius of it is the branding crossover. Jacob's followers, many of whom have become deeply invested in his life and his corner of Maine, are the exact demographic that might book a stay at a coastal Maine cottage. Guests have the possibility of meeting him, purchasing fresh lobsters directly from him if he's out fishing during their stay. The fishing channel and the hospitality business feed each other in a way that doesn't feel manufactured because it isn't. It's the same family, the same coast, the same identity. They now have 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter. The oldest son, Jace, has already appeared in Jacob's videos, including a memorable clip where the two of them catch and then release a lobster that was estimated to be nearly a century old. Jacob has been clear that he wants to pass the knowledge down. He also wants his children to choose for themselves. The license can't be passed down. That's not how Maine's system works. But the hours, the knowledge, the relationship with the ocean, those things can be inherited. One phone call, one conversation. That's all it took to change the direction of everything. Here is something that almost never comes up in coverage of Jacob Knowles. He almost didn't become a lobsterman. In high school, he seriously considered a career in aviation. The same YouTube videos that showed him how other teenagers lived also showed him a wider world, and part of that world included flying. He studied it, thought about it, and ultimately felt the pull of the ocean too strongly to walk away. But he didn't walk away from aviation entirely. He went back to it later, got his private pilot's license, and now owns a 1954 Cessna 180. He flies it regularly around Maine, hunting trips, aerial scouting, just exploration. His Instagram bio lists pilot before it lists lobster fisherman. The plane is not a flex. It fits the exact pattern of everything else he's done. Jacob Knowles is someone who identifies as a person who does things, who builds skills, who stays curious, who doesn't stop at the edges of the life he was handed. He turned a fishing operation into a content business. He turned a coastal property into a rental brand. He learned to fly a 60-year-old aircraft and still goes out and hauls traps before most people have had their first cup of coffee. The New York Times called him an online veteran. CBS Saturday Morning sent a crew to spend a day on the water with him. Maine media has covered him extensively. None of it seems to have changed the texture of his daily life in any meaningful way. He still lives in Winter Harbor. He still fishes the same zone. His graduating class was still 20 people. What changed is the scale of who's watching and the structure of the operation supporting it. He has a videographer now. He has a talent agent. He has a merch line. He has corporate partnerships. And he still goes out in the dark, before the world is awake, and hauls traps out of cold Atlantic water, because that's what he is before any of the rest of it. At this point in the story, most people walked away. What he did instead is the part nobody talks about. Jacob Knowles is 32 years old as of 2026. His YouTube channel has crossed 2.4 million subscribers and 1.6 billion total views. His TikTok sits at 3.3 million followers. Instagram has pushed past 1 million. His business contact is handled through a professional talent management agency. He is also still a working lobsterman. That part has not changed, and by his own account, is not going to. The content documents the fishing life. It does not replace it. This is a distinction worth understanding because it runs counter to the typical creator arc, where the content eventually becomes the job and the original work fades into nostalgia. For Jacob, the lobstering is the job. The content is the account of it. What has changed is the architecture around him. Rest Ashore Cottages operates with multiple properties. The brand partnerships are ongoing. The aviation content has started appearing more regularly alongside the fishing material. His channel now covers not just lobstering, but the broader outdoor lifestyle of down East Maine. Hunting, skiing, flying, exploring, all framed through the same personality that made the original fishing content work. The industry he's part of continues to face real uncertainty. The NOAA whale rope regulations remain an unresolved pressure point. As of mid-2026, Maine's congressional delegation is still pushing to extend the regulatory pause on new gear requirements, with one bill seeking to hold the line until 2035. The herring bait situation has partially stabilized, but the structural vulnerability of a fishery that depends on a single bait species remains. Jacob has not shied away from any of this. He has talked about it on his platforms, testified about it in the legislature, and incorporated the reality of the industry's pressures into the narrative of his content, rather than papering over it. His son Jace will grow up knowing how to fish. Whether he chooses to do it commercially, whether the license system and the regulatory environment even allow it, is a question Jacob says he's leaving open. He wants to give his kids the knowledge. The choice, he says, belongs to them. Here's what most people who discover Jacob Knowles never fully reckon with. The story was never really about lobsters. It was about authenticity in a media environment that had forgotten what the word means. It was about a young man from a town of 475 people who found an audience of millions not by becoming someone else, but by simply showing up as himself, in the dark, in the cold, in orange rubber waders, with a camera pointed at a world that most of his viewers would never otherwise see. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. The story of Jacob Knowles is not really about one man becoming famous. It is about a specific kind of gap that exists in American media, and about what happens when someone with the right combination of knowledge and presence steps into it. For decades, the working-class outdoor world, lobstermen, crab fishermen, timber workers, commercial farmers, existed almost entirely outside the frame of mainstream entertainment. There were reality TV versions of these worlds, heavily produced and often sensationalized. But there was almost nothing that looked like the real thing. Nothing that explained the mechanics and the ethics and the economics of a working fishery with the casual precision of someone who had been doing the job since before they were a teenager. Jacob Knowles stepped into that gap by accident. He filmed a 26-second clip about a female lobster, posted it because it seemed interesting, and discovered that tens of millions of people had been quietly waiting for exactly that kind of content, without knowing it existed, to wait for. The proof of concept is now undeniable. His success has opened the door for a broader category of working world creators, people in industries that have never had a media personality who could speak from the inside rather than narrating from the outside. The fishing space has expanded. The agricultural space has expanded. The trades have expanded. Not all of it traces directly back to Jacob, but his scale, 1.6 billion views and counting, demonstrated that the appetite was there at a level nobody in the creator economy had accurately measured. He also proved something specific about sustainability. Most viral content has a half-life measured in weeks. Jacob's audience has compounded over years because the content is tied to something real, a life, a trade, a place, a family, that doesn't run out of material. Every season brings new catches. Every year brings new pressures on the industry. Every trip with his son is a new chapter in a story his audience is genuinely invested in. What really happened to Jacob Knowles is simple. And it is not what the title of this video implies. Nothing went wrong. Nothing collapsed. No departure, no drama, no scandal. What happened is that a fifth-generation lobsterman from a town most Americans couldn't find on a map built one of the most genuine, durable content brands in the outdoor space by refusing to be anything other than exactly what he already was. That turns out to be the rarest thing on the internet. The story of Jacob Knowles is really the story of what happens when authenticity meets an audience that's hungry for the real thing, and when a man who could have walked away from his family's trade decides, again and again, to stay. He is still in Winter Harbor, still hauling traps, still flying the Cessna, still building the cottage business with Ashley, still posting from the boat at sunrise, in conditions that most content creators would refuse to work in, because that's what the job requires, and the job is what he is. The next chapter is already being written, whether it includes his son hauling traps beside him, whether the regulatory battles reshape the fishery he's built his life on, whether the platform audience continues to grow or levels off, none of it changes what he's already accomplished. He documented a world that was disappearing from public consciousness and brought it back into view. Do you think Jacob's story only works because he was born into lobstering? Or do you think he could have built the same brand from any trade he cared enough about? Leave your answer below.